There's something nobody warns you about when you become a Christian. God goes silent sometimes, not forever, not because he's gone. But there are seasons, real, prolonged seasons, where prayer feels like talking to a wall, where the Bible feels like words on paper, where you used to feel something when you worshipped, and now you feel nothing, where the clarity you once had has been replaced by fog so thick you can't see 2 feet in front of you, and nobody tells you what that means. So you assume the worst. You think you did something wrong. You think he's disappointed. You think he left. But what if the silence isn't his absence? What if it's his setup? Because when you study the moments in Scripture right before God spoke, really spoke, in a way that changed everything, you find a pattern. The same conditions, over and over, appearing in person after person's life right before the breakthrough came. And if those conditions are happening in your life right now, you need to hear this. Let me take you to one of the most famous silences in all of Scripture. Elijah had just come off the greatest victory of his life, Mount Carmel. He had called down fire from heaven in front of hundreds of prophets of Baal. He had prayed and ended a 3-year drought. He had outrun a chariot. In one day, he had done more than most prophets accomplish in a lifetime. And then he got a death threat from Queen Jezebel, and something broke inside him. The man who had just called fire from heaven ran into the wilderness under a juniper tree, and he said to God, "It is enough. Take away my life. I'm not better than my fathers." The greatest prophet in Israel, fresh off his greatest miracle, wanted to die. Then God did something unexpected. He didn't rebuke Elijah. He didn't remind him of Mount Carmel. He sent an angel who touched him and said, "Arise and eat." Twice. Just arise and eat, because the journey ahead is too great for you. Elijah traveled 40 days to a cave at Horeb, the mountain of God. And there, God asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And God told him to stand on the mountain. What came next was spectacular. A wind so violent it tore mountains apart and shattered rocks. Then an earthquake. Then fire. And God was not in any of them. Then, after all the noise and spectacle and power, a still small voice, translated in some versions as a gentle whisper, a sound of sheer silence. And it was there, in the whisper after the storm, that God finally gave Elijah his next assignment. Here's what that story establishes before anything else. God's most important communications often come in the conditions you'd least expect, not in the spectacular, not in the comfortable, in the aftermath, in the quiet, in the cave you ran to because you couldn't handle anything else. If you're in a cave right now, you might be closer to the voice than you think. The first condition that appears right before God speaks is this: you are completely exhausted, not tired, exhausted. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Where you've been strong for so long that you don't even know how to ask for help anymore. Where you've been carrying something heavy for months, maybe years, and the weight has finally become more than you can manage with your own strength. Look at Elijah under the juniper tree. He had been running on supernatural fuel for 3 years. Spiritual highs, confrontations, miracles. And then, in one moment, it ran out. He didn't just get tired. He collapsed. He sat under a tree and said, "I can't do this anymore." Look at Moses after decades of leading Israel through the wilderness. He hit a wall so hard that he told God, "If this is how you're going to treat me, please kill me right now." Moses, the man who parted the Red Sea, asking to die because the burden had become unbearable. Look at David in Psalm 22. "I am a worm and not a man. I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but find no rest. Not a moment of weakness. A documented collapse." And here's the pattern. In every single one of these cases, the exhaustion was immediately followed by a divine encounter that gave them exactly what they needed for the next chapter. Elijah got fed, rested, and then received his next assignment. Moses got the 70 elders to share his burden, and then a promise of what was coming. David's Psalm 22, which begins in absolute despair, ends with one of the most confident declarations of God's faithfulness in all of Scripture. The exhaustion wasn't the end of the story. It was the condition right before the next chapter started. So if you are running on empty right now, if you have nothing left and you don't know how much longer you can hold on, pay attention. The angel that touched Elijah didn't wait for him to recover his strength first. He came while Elijah was still on the ground. God doesn't wait for you to be okay before he shows up. He shows up because you're not. The second condition, nothing makes sense anymore. The plan you had, the one that seemed so clear, has stopped making sense. The direction you were sure God gave you has become unclear. You're second-guessing decisions you were once certain about. And the fog isn't lifting. It's thickening. Take Samuel. One of the most important moments in Israel's history was the night God first spoke to him. But here's the detail most people skip over. When God called Samuel's name, Samuel ran to Eli 3 times. 3 times he heard the voice and didn't recognize it. He was so sure it was the old priest calling him that it took Eli himself to explain what was happening. Samuel heard the voice and didn't know it was God. Not because he was faithless, because he'd never heard it before. And what looks like confusion in that story is actually the exact condition that preceded one of the most significant prophetic commissions in the entire Old Testament. Or look at the disciples on the road to Emmaus. This is after the resurrection. 2 of Jesus' followers are walking away from Jerusalem, heads down, totally lost. Their whole world had just collapsed. They're confused, grieving, and walking in the wrong direction. And a stranger appears and starts walking with them. They don't recognize him. They pour out everything to this stranger, the hope they had, the loss they felt, the confusion that remained. And it's only later, when he breaks bread with them at the table, that their eyes are opened and they realize they had been walking with the risen Christ the whole time. And they said to each other afterward, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road?" The confusion wasn't blocking the encounter. The confusion was the road the encounter happened on. So if you don't know which way to go right now, if the direction you were sure about has become uncertain, if the plan has fallen apart and you can't see what comes next, stay on the road. Keep walking. The person walking beside you in the confusion might be exactly who you think isn't there. The third condition. Things are being taken away that you didn't plan to lose. Not one thing, multiple things. In a season where nothing stays, a relationship ends, a door closes, something you built falls apart, the circle gets smaller, the resources get thinner, and you're trying to hold on to what remains while watching the rest go. This is possibly the most disorienting condition on this list, because loss feels like contradiction. You believe God is for you, but your circumstances look like he's against you. How do you reconcile that? Go back to John 15. Jesus is talking to his disciples the night before he dies, and he says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." The branch that bears fruit gets pruned. Not the dead branch, not the failing branch, the fruitful one. The one that's producing gets cut back, not to punish it, to increase what it can hold. Because an unpruned vine doesn't produce more, it spreads its energy thin across too many shoots and produces less of what matters. What feels like loss in this season may be pruning. Not punishment, not abandonment, strategic removal of things that were spreading you too thin to carry what's coming. But here's what makes this condition particularly important in the context of this video. Pruning always happens before a new season of fruit. You don't prune a vine after the harvest. You prune it before spring. The cutting comes right before the growth. So if things are being taken away right now, if the stripping feels relentless and you don't understand what God is doing, ask a different question. Not why is this being taken, but what is being prepared for the space this is leaving. The fourth condition is the one people most often misidentify. There is a hunger in you right now that nothing is satisfying. You've tried to fill it with work, with relationships, with ministry, with distraction, and none of it touches it. It's a spiritual hunger that sits beneath everything else, a longing you can't name, a restlessness that doesn't go away when your circumstances change. Most people diagnose this as discontentment, or as spiritual failure. Shouldn't a mature Christian be at peace? But this hunger has a specific signature in Scripture. It's not the hunger of someone running from God. It's the hunger of someone being drawn towards something they haven't found yet. Psalm 42. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? That psalm was written in a season of absence. The writer was separated from the temple, separated from worship, surrounded by people who mocked his faith. And the hunger that season produced wasn't emptiness. It was a specific, directed longing for God himself, not for his gifts, not for relief, not for circumstances to change. For him. That kind of hunger is almost always produced by a season of spiritual drought. And the pattern in Scripture is consistent. The drought produces the thirst, and the thirst positions you to receive what God is about to say. Jesus said it himself. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Not the comfortable, not the full, the hungry ones. The ones who have been brought to the end of everything else and find that they want God more than they've ever wanted him before. If there's a hunger in you right now that nothing is touching, don't try to fill it with something else. That hunger is the preparation, because God speaks most clearly to people who have nothing left to hear him through except him. The fifth condition is the hardest one. God has been quiet for longer than feels reasonable, and it's starting to feel personal. Not a bad day, not a bad week. An extended silence that has made you wonder whether something is wrong with you specifically, whether you're the problem, whether there's a version of intimacy with God that other people have and you somehow can't access. Here's the most important thing I can say in this entire video. The silence that feels like rejection is often the silence of preparation. Go to Lazarus. John 11. Lazarus is sick. His sisters, Mary and Martha, the people closest to Jesus, send word to him. Not a casual message, an urgent one. Lord, the one you love is sick. They're not asking a stranger for help. They're calling on their closest friend. And Jesus received the message and stayed where he was for 2 more days, on purpose. Lazarus died. The sisters were devastated. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha came out and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That sentence contains one of the most human responses to divine silence in all of Scripture. If you had been here, if you had responded when I called, if you hadn't been quiet. And then Jesus wept, not because the situation was hopeless. He was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He wept because the people he loved had suffered in the silence, and he entered their grief before he resolved it. Then he called Lazarus out of the tomb, 4 days dead, in front of everyone. And John records the result. Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. If Jesus had come immediately when called, Lazarus would have been healed. Quietly, privately, one family comforted. But because he waited, because he allowed the silence to stretch past what felt bearable, what happened instead was a public resurrection that produced mass faith. The silence wasn't indifference. It was precision. The delay wasn't a failure to respond. It was a recalibration of what the response would accomplish. Your silence may not be about you at all. It may be about what God is setting up that requires the timing to be exactly right. And exactly right sometimes means later than you can understand with what you currently know. So what do you do with all of this? Because knowing that the silence has a purpose doesn't make it easier to sit in. Knowing that the conditions you're in are the conditions right before God speaks doesn't make the waiting comfortable. Here's what Scripture shows us, again and again, about how to posture yourself in these moments. First, stay present in the silence. Don't run from it. Elijah's instinct was to run, to get away from the place where he'd heard from God, to the wilderness, to a cave. And God didn't call him back out of the cave. He met him there. He spoke from the cave. The place you ran to because you couldn't handle anything else is a valid place to receive from God. Don't assume the cave disqualifies you. Sometimes the cave is the destination. Second, say what's true, not what's faithful sounding. The Psalms of lament are not polished. They are raw. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is in Scripture. How long, O Lord, appears again and again. God is not fragile. He is not offended by your honesty. The disciples on the road to Emmaus poured out their grief and confusion to a stranger, not knowing it was Jesus. Their honesty about their despair was part of what opened the encounter. Third, expect the whisper, not the earthquake. Elijah looked for God in the spectacular and found him in the still, small voice. In a season of divine silence, the temptation is to look for the dramatic sign, the big moment, the unmistakable confirmation. But God's voice in these seasons is often quiet, gentle, easy to dismiss as your own thought. Train yourself to pay attention to the small things, the Scripture that lands differently than it used to, the moment of unexpected peace, the thought that returns again and again. The whisper is often louder than the earthquake if you've learned how to listen for it. I want to end where we started. Elijah, in a cave, at the end of himself, asked God to take his life. He had nothing left, and God didn't argue with him, didn't correct him, didn't remind him of what he'd accomplished. He sent an angel with bread and water and said, "The journey is too great for you. Rest, eat, get up." And then he spoke, not because Elijah had recovered his strength, not because Elijah had figured it out, not because the circumstances had improved, but because Elijah had finally come to the end of doing this on his own. That's where the voice came, not on Mount Carmel, not in the miracle, in the cave, after the earthquake, after the fire, in a whisper so gentle you'd almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. If you're in the cave right now, if you're exhausted, confused, stripped, hungry, and sitting in a silence that has lasted longer than you know how to hold, I want you to hear something. You haven't been forgotten. You haven't been abandoned. You haven't done something that put you outside the reach of his voice. The conditions you're in are some of the most recognized conditions in Scripture for divine encounter. The silence before the voice. The cave before the commission. The emptiness before the filling. Stay. Be still. And listen for the whisper, because the earthquake already came. And the fire already came. And what comes next is different.